This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I am your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media accounts, my columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, which are still on hold while they're reorganizing, all the other podcasts we've done, my photography website. You can also be a supporter of this podcast at Patreon, patreon.com/hikingbob, and help support this podcast. We recently bought some new equipment because my co-host Kevin had a really poor microphone on his laptop. We got him a new one that made his audio a lot better. So all that stuff you can do at my website at hikingbob.com. And don't forget to sign up for my newsletter so you can find out what the latest stuff is we got going on here. Today, I am happy to have back as my guest, Carl Bauer, who is the district ranger for the Pikes Peak Ranger District. I always have to make sure I get all this stuff right. Of the Pike and San Isabel and Cimarron and Comanche Grassland National Forest. Boy, I hope I got all that stuff right. Carl, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Bob. You did.
Cool. It's a mouthful, and I've had previous public affairs people get upset with me when I don't include everything. And I also want to thank you for being on the podcast again, and your public affairs people for really helping make this happen. I know there's a lot of hoops at the Forest Service we have to go through, but they really have been helpful in making this happen. So I appreciate everybody's help. Carl, last time we talked, we kind of just introduced you to the listeners. You have been here for, I guess we're just now coming up on a year as the district ranger here. So we talked about your career and how you kind of cycled through Colorado, cycled back out, and cycled back in here again. But I guess we want to talk about more stuff specific to the Pikes Peak District. So I guess I'll ask you a simple question. How does this compare to other districts you've been to? I mean, I know you came here from Florida. Obviously, the land is a little different, but how does it compare to places as far as population and usage and things like that? How does this compare to where you've been?
Well, thanks, Bob. Well, Pikes Peak Ranger District is it's a busy place, of course. And remember, I left the Pike San Isabel about 9-10 years ago out of the San Carlos Ranger District out of Canyon City. So I'm familiar with the Pike, but after leaving here, I went to Oregon again, and that was on the Oregon coast. And that was a busy place as well. That's sort of what I'm after in my career. I'm up for challenges. And then on the Oregon coast, it was we had the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, and it was a big OHV area, as well as it was a big timber forest. And we did a lot of Douglas fir thinning in support of the spotted owl. So that was very, very involved. And then in Florida, of course, we did some serious forest management there as well. Sand pine was a big vegetation type we had on the forest, and we would literally clear cut, 200 to 400 acres of that, as was appropriate for that ecosystem that like to burn every 1 to 2 years. And that supported many endangered species and endemic species. And so that was interesting. And again, that was a big recreation forest as well. And it had the added benefit of having like 8.5 million people within an hour's drive of the district boundary. So actually coming to Pikes Peak, the population here is much less than in Florida. So I know folks along the Front Range consider it very overpopulated or very densely populated. And I guess, it's changed a lot since I've been here, of course, but there's definitely places out there that receive more use and have more people knocking on your door. So in that respect, Pikes Peak Ranger District's a little easier for just generally speaking.
I guess for people who are mostly used to recreating in the outdoors, we have to remind ourselves that the primary purpose of the Forest Service is not to manage recreation. I mean, is that a fair assessment. I mean, your job is to manage the forest, so it may require thinning, it may require various types of management, and recreation is not necessarily at the top of the list. Is that a fair assessment of what your job is there at the Forest Service?
Well, here at the Forest Service, we obviously are a multiple use management agency. So timber, wildlife, recreation, oil and gas. So those things come to mind, of course. And but you're right, recreation is a big program, and sometimes that's the biggest interface we have with our public is through the recreation program, and we get some of our employees' first experience with the Forest Service is them recreating on the National Forest. So that is a big program for us, as well as fire. The fire suppression program. We bring in a lot of young people into our fire program, and then they learn about the Forest Service and sometimes branch out and begin working in other resource areas.
When I think about the Pike Ranger District, your Ranger District, it didn't seem like there was enough, and this is from the outside looking in, this is from me as an average user, a lot of average users, that there wasn't enough manpower available to manage the number of users that were there. And like you said, this is compared to where you've been, this is small. We don't have 8 million people within 8 hours of our area. I guess I have two questions. Number one, was that a fair perception? And number two, have things turned around? It seems to me, looking from the outside in, that staffing seems to be suddenly increasing. The funding is increased for more staffing at the Ranger District. Are these two accurate impressions, or are we, those of us looking from the outside in, completely off base here?
So I would say we definitely don't have this recreation staffing that we need to adequately manage the National Forest. And I guess part of that is, to what standard are you managing that program for? We're not the Park Service, and we don't have the staffing nor the funding the Park Service does have. But from our program, some just to meet people's most basic needs and to provide for the health and safety of folks while they're out on the National Forest, we definitely don't have the staffing that we really need for that. It's not for lack of trying, actually, either. We have been very fortunate to receive grants and some other outside funding from our partners and so forth. And we were able to hire some folks that way. At the same time, even using our normal recreation funding, the last 2 years I've been here, we have been unsuccessful in trying to fill some of the jobs that we have. It's something I haven't dealt with in this scale for my whole career. We have 7 seasonal recreation positions that we're trying to fill this summer, and we've only been able to fill 2 to this point. And just people don't seem to be as interested in applying for our positions these days.
So I guess the takeaway from that is, if people think there's not enough help out there in the National Forest for their various recreation things, they can't lay the blame at the feet of the Forest Service. If there's nobody applying for these jobs, there's just nobody applying for these jobs.
I wouldn't say that. I think the Forest Service definitely could do a better job recruiting for folks and trying new things and new ways of trying to attract and entice people to come work for us. I think our mission is something that is one of our strengths, just to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's grasslands and forests, for present and future generations. I think nobody else has that mission, and that just speaks to a certain number of people. And I hope that is still something that resonates with people today. and they want to be a part of.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the message there is if you're looking for a job with the Forest Service, you might want to give Carl a call at the office and tell him you're looking for a job.
You bet.
One of the things I think people look at when they're concerned about staffing and how many of your staff are out there regards positions is law enforcement. And I know that's kind of a little different thing with your office, and we're hoping to have some law enforcement people on here. And one of the concerns was, you'd have one law enforcement person for a very big ranger district, and I understand that that's changing. There's some changes coming up with that, and some more staffing coming in there. Do you want to just speak briefly on the status of law enforcement for your district?
Well, sure. We've had one law enforcement ranger for the past, I don't know how many years, quite a few years. And we were fortunate enough to be able to hire a second one toward the end of last summer. And so we're up to 2 on this district, which is phenomenal. When you say law enforcement, a lot of our field goading folks have some sort of minimal law enforcement capability, and especially our recreation folks. And from a ranger standpoint, employee safety, public safety is always paramount in my mind, and especially in Colorado Springs in these urban environments. Same way in Florida, same way in Oregon. Where our employees can find themselves in some serious situations, and my advice to them was to always, give somebody my card and slowly back away and wish them a nice day, right? Here in Springs, my folks have encountered some pretty hostile public before, and that's still my message to them today. And yeah, you never can be too safe, and at the same time, yeah, we're blessed to have 2 law enforcement rangers dedicated to this district. Again, in comparison to Florida, in Florida I think we had 5 law enforcement rangers on my district, so you can see how intensive that place was. So at the same time, it would be my hope that we could better educate the public and get voluntary compliance every day of the week, rather than have to go a law enforcement route on things. So that's where I'd like to concentrate on, is to have a better Forest Service presence out there in an education and interpretation, and in partnership with folks, and only use law enforcement, for when people really aren't complying. So, yeah.
You mean just have people just play by the rules? That'd be so easy.
If people would simply stay on our designated roads and trails, that would take a lot of the work off of my staff, and it would prevent a lot of the resource damage that's occurring on the Pikes Peak Ranger District.
You mentioned briefly wildfire, and obviously, anybody who's lived in Colorado Springs for any length of time has either experienced some pretty significant wildfires right in the immediate area. And if you've been here as long as I have, we start with the Hayman fire and the Waldo Canyon fire and the Black Forest fire, and a lot of smaller fires that occur every year in this area. And history going back 100 years talks about fires that started in Fort Carson and burned clear to Lake George. So this area is not unknown to fires. And the city has undertaken some pretty good forest fire management along the edge of your ranger district, along Cheyenne, near Cheyenne Mountain and stuff like that. Do you care to talk about? I understand there's been a funding increase or some funding that's come available to your district for wildfire management. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You bet. So we call all that, the name that we refer to is the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. Okay. And that's been going on for a few years now. We're in year 2 of this strategy. That's a new name to some old it was called the bill legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law that gave the Forest Service extra money to deal with reducing the wildfire risk in communities. So this wildfire crisis strategy, basically, we're trying to reduce the hazardous fuels out there on the landscape. We're trying to make the forests as well as the surrounding communities more resilient to wildfire in the future. And we're going to do that by a number of ways, mainly using mechanical fuels reduction type projects, as well as using our other tool is prescribed fire. So that's sort of where we're headed. You mentioned funding. The Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest and ourselves last year received, I think, something like $18 million extra from Congress to specifically address reducing fuels on the national forest. And again, hiring. You mentioned recreation, but I've hired many more fire folks as well as timber folks in the last 6 months than I have for the last 5 years with this new mandate by Congress. So yeah, we're serious about it, and we've got some projects coming up. I think there's something like 500 miles of common boundary between the U.S. Forest Service lands as well as private city or other ownership. And that's concerning. And I want to be able to use this extra funding and this direction from Congress to better make these areas more resilient to wildfire in the future. And yeah, I was here during Waldo Canyon fire. Nobody wants that. And hopefully, if we get some of these projects done and we work together, we can, again, make this place more resilient to future wildfires. The one group that I mentioned before is the Colorado Springs Wildfire Mitigation Committee, which I'm part of, and extremely excited on the work that committee's doing. And they're aiming on, their goal is working on private property as well as city property and other property along the Forest Service boundary and such in some places. And I want to do more with them and coordinate at a higher level than we ever have to try to do some projects on our side of the line to support what they're doing as well, and vice versa. I think there's somebody told me there's like 29 entities in Colorado Springs that have a responsibility to respond to wildfires. And obviously we want to work with those groups, and we do. That's sort of our normal thing, but we're doing it at a much more intense and deliberate manner these days. And we have the funding to do it. So that's pretty exciting. And it's part of the reason why I'm here and why I wanted to come here to begin with, is I wanted to be one of the forests that was dealing with these type of issues. And that's what I want to look back on and say that we did, and we increased the pace and scale of what we could do to try to protect our community here.
Yeah, there's like, you talk about the number of entities. There's about 30 some odd fire departments in El Paso County, and many of them have a specific team or, assigned to wildfire fighting, and a lot of their members are red card trained, which for people who may not be familiar, that's a specific type of certification for wildland firefighting. I was mostly an urban firefighter, so even though I had a long history in firefighting, I did not do a whole lot of wildland fires. I did a little bit, but I was red carded for a little while. But like I explained to my compadres on the wildfire side of thing, I did urban because there wasn't anything that was a 20,000 acre building. So,
Right.
there's something to be said about that. But kudos to the people who do that. Um, I guess the thing I have to ask you is there was a lot of discussion some years ago when the Forest Service was criticized, and I'm not saying it was appropriate, not appropriate, that they would try to put out every single fire that happened and get it in the smallest stages. And the problem was the forest never cleansed itself, so to speak. And it came to the realization that sometimes it's better to let fires burn as opposed to putting them out. But of course, that doesn't always sit well with the public. Is this mitigation strategy that you're working on trying a way to mimic letting fires burn without actually having fires burn? In other words, a way to keep the forest healthy without having the fires, or as you said, maybe sometimes doing the controlled burns?
Right. So this wildfire crisis strategy is based on two things. We're going to respond to that doing two things. One, through our vegetation management, timber. We are in the process as we speak, implementing the West Shoebark project, and that's where we have 400 acres of timber that is going to be removed from the national forest. It's surrounding the one side of Rampart Reservoir, right? And the objective there, obviously, is to make that more fire resilient and to protect the city's watershed and protect the city's source of drinking water, right? And yeah, in the future, hopefully this summer, we're going to let another contract out for another 1,200 acres around Rampart Reservoir. And again, most of that is going to be actually taking vegetation, taking trees off the national forest and removing that fuel from being available to potential future wildfires. And again, beyond that, I think there's another 1,200 acre project that we're thinking again in that same area that's going to do the same thing. We're doing that with our partner, Colorado Springs Utilities. They're funding a lot of this. And we're leveraging other dollars as well. And yeah, it's all in hopes that we can protect that reservoir, protect the citizens' water supply, and reduce the fuels in that area so that when, heaven forbid, another wildfire comes in that area, it will not be as devastating as the Walter Canyon fire was in the past. And Bob, you're right. 100 years of putting every fire out has got us to where we are, right? So there has been 100 years of fuels buildup on the national forest, and things have been able to grow. Wildfire or fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. You know, before we were here, it would come through and burn very low intense fires, and it would clean out the understory. It would provide more sunlight to the forest floor and open up the understory. And today you look out and you can barely see through the forest because of all the increased fuels from the last 100 years, as well as just the buildup of vegetation. So another project that we have, again, we talked about timber projects, but this one's a fuels reduction project centered around the Monument Fire Center up north. And again, it sort of has a long history. It too has had a buildup of fuels over the last 100 years. But in 1989, the Berry Fire, it's about a 1,200 acre fire, started down low, and you can still see the fire scar today if you driving up by 25 and look to the west. And you can see how it went up Mount Herman, and it killed all the mature ponderosa pine trees. So in its place, afterwards, in its recovery, oak brush is like a pioneering species that comes in after a fire. and we are left with a unnatural amount of oak brush in that area. So we've had that for years. We had the Waldo Canyon fire, as you mentioned, that got people's attention. There was the 2015 community wildfire protection plan was written for that area. And it was signed by all the Mount Hermon Community Wildfire Protection Board members, the Tri-Lakes Fire Protection Districts, El Paso County, and State Forest Service, and ourselves. And sort of out of that effort, we got the 2017 Upper Monument Creek EIS and environmental impact statement. And that sort of directed today's project at the Monument Fire Center. We had a couple objectives there. Like I said, one was to make that area a little more resilient to future wildfires. We took out a lot of oak brush. We took out a lot of oak brush and vegetation along the private property Forest Service common boundaries. And we were trying to also promote old growth ponderosa pine by opening up the understory and making it so the remaining trees had the more water, had more light, had a little less competition. And so that's what we did. That project just concluded. Well, this last phase just concluded a couple weeks ago. And I'd asked folks to go out and look at that. I know there was some of the neighbors there, that was a bit of a shock to them. It has changed the landscape pretty dramatically. It was about 1,000 acres. And I know it also impacted people's use of that land and those trails. And that's true. I think most of those trails were not system trails. They're not legal trails. And people were a little upset about that. And it opened it up. And it definitely, you can see through the forest a lot better now. And when we had the high winds the other week, I know I felt just a little bit better knowing that at least the Mount Hermon Road and that west side of the Red Rock subdivision was better protected than it was before, in case somebody was careless with a cigarette butt or fire in that area. So yeah, that's another example of how we're going to try to meet Congress's mandate of trying to deal with our wildfire crisis. And the other thing is, in addition to that, obviously, is the oak brush that we got rid of. It's going to grow back. I know people we're pretty upset about the change of the landscape there and the loss of the oak brush. And I challenged them to go look at the upper part of Monument off of Mount Hermon Road and look at the area that we started at last May, almost a year ago. And you can see that the oak brush has already grown like 8 to 10 inches. So it's already coming back. We knew that was going to happen, of course. We're going to have to go and maintain that in the future. We're either going to maintain it through mechanical means like we did this time by mulching it, or I would like to consider using prescribed fire in the future to try to maintain that. And along those lines, prescribed fire is going to be another tool that we're going to try to use to bring those ecosystems back into balance. Our chief of the Forest Service, Randy Moore, has challenged us to increase the amount of burning we do on national forests 4 times over. So again, fire is a natural part of it. That is a lot. We haven't had a prescribed fire on this forest for a number of years. And we're trying to do some planning right now. And again, I'm going to rely on the 2017 Upper Monument Creek Environmental Impact Statement talked about using prescribed fire. We're going to try to use prescribed fire off of the Rampart Range Road in a small section, when appropriate, under the right circumstances, under the right weather conditions and fuel conditions. We're going to make sure we have enough resources, and we're going to try to put some prescribed fire on the ground this fall, hopefully. And again, we haven't done that for a while. We need to get back in the groove and get back into doing that pretty regularly. So more to come on that. We were, and I guess we're building on last fall. I was really fortunate to help out a little bit on the San Carlos Ranger District, my old Ranger District, out of Canyon City, way down south, on a 3,000 acre prescribed fire that this forest pulled together and pooled resources together, and we pulled off a 3,000 acre prescribed fire near Gardner. And that was successful, and we need to build on that. So yeah, in Florida, we would burn 25 to 50,000 acres a year. And believe me, I understand we're not in Florida, and the public in Colorado is definitely not as open to having that much smoke in the air. And we need to work with our public. We need to work with our state folks who issue smoke permits to us, to be able to, to be able to start small, earn some trust, and get the smoke permits that we need to be able to pull off large scale prescribed fires like the one we did near Gardner.
Well, I want to go back on a couple of things. You mentioned the shoe bar swath you were working on. So for people who may not be familiar, that is the area on the west side of Rampart Reservoir, curving around to the north. Is that a good way to describe that?
Yes.
Along Shoebarth Road there. So it's kind of like you got the Air Force Academy's little recreation area up there, with the name of which is now escaping me, on one side of the road. You got the reservoir on the other side of the road. And that's one of my favorite places to go for hiking and stuff. So
Okay.
I might lose a trail or two while you're doing all this stuff. But and then the other one, the berry fire you talked to, that was just before I moved here. But for people not familiar with that, as you're going up Mount Herman Road, just past the gate, that's all that scrub oak on the left side of the road going down, where you see where all the big trees are gone. That the whole thing was the berry fire. And I had a lot of firefighters who were there told me about that fire, and it burned for quite a while. I think it's why the trees, just the scrub oak, and that scrub oak takes over and kind of chokes everything else out. So thinning that out would definitely be obviously a tremendous advantage, because obviously I'd like to see the bigger trees come back in there. They probably do a better job of restoring the forest than just those low scrub oak that really are dense, and I'm sure they keep a lot of sun from actually hitting the bottom and helping the soil there.
You bet. No, scrub oak is it outcompetes a lot of other vegetation, and by removing it, the hope is that we get more sunlight to the forest floor to encourage the other natural species that will normally be present there, and actually increase the diversity of plants and animals that use that whole area, and have more edge effect for the deer. And so yeah, I can see it'd be fun to watch the next couple of years, seeing that redevelop and grow. And I challenge the public to go out and pay attention to that and watch that periodically.
When the Colorado Springs Forestry Department started doing their mitigation work, especially working on all that low shrub, the low fuels, not the trees, but the low fuels, there was a lot of uproar because people said it was really, changing the landscape a lot, didn't look very attractive. But now you go back and look a year or two later, and obviously you could see where that actually was beneficial. It's kind of shocking to see it when it first happens, but if you're patient, wait a year or so, you can really see how that helps benefit the forest and how everything looks healthier than it was just dense, low vegetation through there, choking out the trees, choking out everything else. It does look better. It is a shock to see it when it first happens. It looks like you've devastated the forest floor. But I think patience is the word for people who see that and complain. Like, just hang on a year and you'll see how this actually benefits, how it benefits. I think there's still some benefit to fire because there's some chemical things that happen to the soil with fire. But as you said, kind of an unpopular thing in the West. I think if we had that happen here, but and more acceptable maybe in Florida than it would be here. But I think, I think people are beginning to recognize, as you said, 100 years of putting every fire out was really not great management technique. It was what people knew to do. I mean, I'm not going to, people 100 years ago probably didn't have all the knowledge we have now, but it looked like the right thing to do. And obviously we know now it wasn't the best thing to do. And it's good to see that there's this funding and process and partnerships that are being more proactive with this stuff. So if we have another fire, which inevitably we'll have for whatever reason, lightning or whatever, we don't end up with another Waldo Canyon or a Black Forest or a Hayman fire or something like that that just really wipes out large swaths of land.
Right. The idea is we're never going to eliminate wildfire from the ecosystem. We can just hopefully manage and shape it a little bit such that the fire that does result is not as intense and isn't as destructive to obviously people or property, and not as destructive to the remaining resources and the soil as we have witnessed in other recent wildfires.
Cool. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go back to recreation. I've got 3 things to talk about on recreation for you. So number 1 is the city is beginning its Blodgett master plan, which does not include Blodgett, the top of Blodgett Peak, because that's outside the city parks territory, but it's in the forest. And so that's yours. And, but it concerns the area around it. But we were told at a meeting last week that they are working with, or there's some plans to work with your office to actually allow the city to maybe help manage all the way up to the peak. Can you talk a little bit about where those plans are or how that process is going? People love going there, and they yell at the city because they can't get to the peak, and the city has to explain, well, we don't own the peak. That belongs to the Forest Service. But, that distinction is lost among people when they're just out on a trail.
Yeah, you bet, Bob. So I must say that one of the large challenges that we have on this district is the proliferation of illegal user-created trails. And most of those, I dare say, are non-motorized trails, actually. And that's why I said earlier that to be the greatest help to the Forest Service, people could just simply stay on the designated official trails that are on our maps and so forth. Yes, the city came to us last year with the idea that they're going to do a master trail planning effort in the Blodgett Peak area. And obviously its namesake, Blodgett Peak, is on Pikes Peak Ranger District and on U.S. Forest Service lands. And it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds, actually. The city is, like I said earlier, is a great partner. I trust David Dietmeyer. And I think I was taking a leap of faith, and I am going to try to work with the city and the public to try to see if we can come up with a sustainable route to the top of Blodgett Peak, right? Honestly, my first priority on this district is this wildfire crisis strategy, and my whole staff is focused toward that. Recreation is also obviously important, but we are not in anywhere. My staff does not have the capacity right now to deal with being in full partnership with the city or anyone to do a trails master plan for the Front Range of Colorado Springs, which is really what I would like to see. That's sort of a dream that needs to be planned out and planned for in the future. But in the meantime, we have these proliferation of user-created trails, and I get asked, my staff gets asked all the time to try to make these trails a part of the system, and we just can't, with a stroke of a pen, make that happen. They have to be analyzed, and we need to analyze the impacts of that trail, whether it's sustainable and meets our standards and all that stuff. So as a stopgap measure, I took the opportunity to partner with the city to see if we can work on and have the city lead a planning effort that includes a possible route up to Blodgett Peak. I'm taking the leap of faith. I hope this doesn't come back to bite me. You know, when we have a designated trail up Blodgett Peak, I don't want to see a half dozen other trails leading off of Blodgett Peak all of a sudden headed to the next door peak 3 miles away, and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I'm going to trust the public to do the right thing and stay on the trail going up to the top of Blodgett Peak and not create additional trails off of that trail.
Yeah, the issue with road trails, I don't even like calling them social trails because they're actually road trails. They don't belong there. It's something we've discussed with the city before, and I've had them on this podcast. I've talked to Scott Abbott before about that. It is an issue, and it's even worse when you have people who are, you kind of understand how when an area is not managed, how people just kind of created their own trail by finding a way someplace. It's a little different with some of the more disturbing things we've been seeing where people are going up there with tools and actually cutting down trees and cutting trails without any authorization, without planning, not necessarily understanding the impacts of what they're doing. I think it's a good sign, and I hope your leap of faith is beneficial for everybody, that you're working with the city in developing a trail to the top of Blodgett Peak. The one that's up there now is terrible. Usually on the way up, they lose it, go up this rock fall, and on the way down, they find the right trail. It's so steep that almost everybody I know, and it's happened to me a couple of times, slips and ends up on their butt because it's so steep. It definitely needs some work. It definitely needs to be better than the unofficial trail that's up there. And yes, I am admitting to being on an unofficial trail. There's not many people probably like me didn't even know it wasn't unofficial at the time. So I like seeing this. I think this is a great move on your part and also pretty proactive on everybody's part to work this out, because like I said, people are going to enter that from a city park and end up in the Forest Service land, and they are may not realize the boundary, and B, to be honest with you, they don't care. They want to keep going on their hike, and however they go from one piece of land to another is kind of immaterial to most people. So whatever happens to make that easier for people, I think is a great idea. The other one I want to talk to you about is Waldo Canyon. The city bought, in addition to that land just been annexed into as part of the Blodgett open space along the quarry, was the Black Canyon Quarry that's up above Williams Canyon. And one of the things with that was hopefully going to provide access to the top of Williams Canyon, which is Forest Service property, over towards Waldo Canyon. And a lot of that process, well, a couple years back, there was a big community process to look at Waldo Canyon. Your predecessor was a big part of that. I participated, a lot of groups did, to kind of develop a plan that was supposed to be one step in a NEPA process to allow access. Access is allowed in Waldo Canyon now, but you're not supposed to be on the trails. Where are we at with getting a new trail system in Waldo Canyon? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, honestly, Bob, I don't know much more than what you said about that Waldo Canyon effort right now. I know the area you're talking about, the city's efforts there, but right now that's pretty low on our list. And I'm vaguely familiar with the public input process that you're speaking of. I've read a couple of those reports a while back, but right now, honestly, that's pretty low on our priority list. Okay,
fair enough. And the last recreation thing I want to ask you about was the Section 16 trail over behind Red Rock Canyon open space, and back in there where we had that rock slide that occurred about a year ago now, I think it is. and wiped out a bridge. And I've seen some recent aerial drone footage of that. I think it's worse than people realize when you get an aerial view of it. My understanding is you've had some assessments done and steps are being taken to get that reopened. Can you talk to us about what's going on there?
Yeah, you're right. We hired a contractor, geotechnical contractor, come in and do an analysis of that rock slide area. And we finally got that report back. We also had a risk assessment completed for that area. So with those two documents, I decided to go ahead and reopen the trail pending some other work that we need to do. It's my understanding it also took out the bridge that crossed the creek there. I'm not going to wait until we replace the bridge to reopen the trail, but I do need to install some signing along the trail, just warning people of that fact. I know that sort of sounds crazy. It's rocks can fall anytime, anywhere on the forest, but in this particular area, I think it warrants some extra caution and to make the public aware of that fact, especially being an urban trail and the visitors that we have might not be as aware of their surroundings as visitors elsewhere. So anyway, just trying to reinforce that a little bit. I'm working with the city to, once I get approval for those signs, the city's volunteered to help produce and install those signs. So I think we might be about a month out on reopening that trail officially. And it's going to be in the same location as it was before the slide. So we're not going to reroute the trail or anything like that at this point. And hopefully we'll be able to, again, work with the city and scrounge up some money somewhere to try to replace that bridge eventually as well.
Well, that bridge was about a whole 5 feet long, so it wasn't a very big span. It was just it was some planking and stuff that was in there. So hopefully replacing that's not a long drawn out or expensive process. And you're right, where that happened, it was cut into a steep slope. So really it'd be difficult to reroute that because it's steep on the left side as you're going. I always like doing that one clockwise. So as you're going up, there was steep on the left side and very steep going down on the right where the rock fall went. That was very steep. So I would imagine be difficult to reroute that anyway. And hopefully building a new bridge there won't be too difficult. So glad to hear. So about a month out from that trail, finally reopened. I guess the signs are going to say, don't hang around here, just get through this area or something along those lines.
Something along those lines. We don't want people watering in that area and having a picnic or anything there.
Yeah.
Just to keep moving, just like somewhat similar to what you see on the highway at places as well.
Yeah, like Falling Rock area and stuff like that.
Yeah.
One other thing that's come up, and I will probably discuss this a little bit more with, when I interview some of your law enforcement people. There's been an issue in our national forest with people, and I want to make sure I get the wording right, people who don't have homes, people who are unhoused, I guess, and they're taking up residence in the forest. That was an issue here in this district some years ago when it was something new. And I know that kind of caught the district a little shorthanded. They had people who were maybe not trained for it or maybe not equipped for it, having to go clean up these sites and mitigate them, and new equipment was needed, and you had to have a place to dump all this stuff. How is that situation in this district now? Is that a little more under control, do you think? I know you have partners like Focus on the Forest based out of Woodland Park is a great help to you in cleaning up some of that. How is that going in the district? Is it a little better than it's been, or where are we at?
Well, that's a good question, Bob. In comparison to other districts and other forests I've worked on, Florida was a big challenge in that department. And we had folks pretty regularly on the forest. And we worked with some of the county agencies and so forth to try to get people help and get people pointed in the right direction and receive services and so forth. But quite frankly, when people live on the national forest permanently or for long periods of time, it poses a risk to both employees as well as the public. There are all types of health and safety issues associated with that. And yeah, it's a concern here on the Pikes Peak Ranger District. We see that a lot of places. The forest being so accessible sort of invites that use, apparently. And honestly, I don't know what the real answer is, but again, I look to our partners, population growth of Colorado Springs, and this is also growing. This issue and this concern is also growing on the national forest. And you're right, we don't have near the capacity to deal with this. We would be cleaning up sites every day of the week for all summer, really. Focus on the Forest is one of the most outstanding volunteer groups I've ever worked with in my career. The amount of work that they do and the amount of trash that they remove off the national forest is phenomenal. Thousands and thousands of pounds of trash are removed pretty regularly. And unfortunately, we, the Forest Service, don't have a really good way of disposing of some of the materials that we remove off the forest. I have a field full of dilapidated campers and trailers and vehicles, and they're people's property. They're abandoned. We have a process we use to go through that to dispose of that properly, but we ended up with it, and it costs an absorbent amount of money each year to dispose of that material properly, and we don't have the money to actually do that. Focus on the forests helps us out tremendously with that, but it only goes to a point. It goes to where we have it in a field under lock and key, and we have a small junkyard growing on our administrative site, and we need other people's help to try to figure out how to dispose of this finally. And I haven't figured that out yet, honestly. Focus on the Forest does an astronomical job in removing vehicles and campers and all types of trash off the national forest. But the vehicles and campers and so forth end up in our administrative site, in our little junkyard. And from that point forward, I don't have a good way of finally having a final disposal of those type of things. So I'm open for ideas.
Got it. Well, we had Focus on the Forest on the podcast here a while back, and I will encourage people to go look at my podcast page on my website. You can scroll down and find it and see the great work that they do. A really great bunch of people, and they kind of got put on hold for a while during the COVID years, but I understand they're back at it and really doing some tremendous work and helping them out. But I think it's also incumbent on us as the users to pack it in, pack it out, not leave your stuff behind. Don't be a slob. Don't leave your cars abandoned out there. Just be good to our forest. Carl, we've had a great conversation here. Is there anything you want to talk to us about that I may have forgotten to ask you before we go?
Well, I did mention recreation. We talked about that being also a priority behind the wildfire crisis strategy, of course. But one of the things that we're working on from a recreation standpoint is our continued efforts to properly manage target shooting on this district. And obviously the Pikes Isabel, Comanche Cimarron National Grasslands are part of the Southern Shooting Partnership. It's a group of like 11 federal and state agencies, county agencies, and utilities folks trying to address the growing challenge of recreational sport shooting on public lands. And I've been told we've been working on this for about 5 years. And obviously, if you've ever visited the National Forest, you will find the remnants of recreational target shooting places. Some places more so than others, but it's a concern for a number of reasons. One, obviously from a public health and safety standpoint, the number of visitors visiting our national forests, the number of visitors being off trail, as we talked about, might find themselves in an area that target shooters may not be aware of their presence and cause some serious safety concerns, obviously. And yeah, with the increased number of residents around and within the national forest, that's also a concern as well. So yeah, we started this process with our partners about 5 years ago. We started an analysis of this issue using our NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, and we went out back in January 2021 for some public input on this, and based on that, we've come back and refined our proposed action, and that proposed action will come out hopefully soon, about mid-May, if everything goes as planned. Our proposed action is going to include, for the Pikes Peak Ranger District, possibly 2 designated recreational target shooting sites, one being turkey tracks and the other one being the 370I location on Pikes Peak Ranger District. This effort also includes the South Park and the South Platte Ranger Districts, and there's some sites also planned for possible development on those districts as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I hope we can address that need. Recreational target practicing, I believe, is a legitimate use of the national forest. Of course, we just need to make sure that we do it in a safe manner so that we don't get hurt. No one gets hurt out there, as well as we do it in an environmentally sensitive manner as well, and make sure that we're cleaning up after ourselves and following all of the rules and regs that we have to, specifically the NEPA requirements and the EPA requirements for groundwater quality and so forth.
I remember the days of the old shooting range on Rampart Range Road, which was closed up some years ago, and how that became just an environmental disaster because everybody brought anything and everything to shoot up there and then left it behind, and which resulted in its closure and a very complicated cleanup effort. Which now you go up there, you probably, unless you know it was there before, you wouldn't know that it was there. It's good to see that happening. I know on the Mount Herman Road, they had to close that to target shooting because people on the Mount Herman Trail had some very close calls and some near misses. People were afraid to go hiking there. So you're right, it's legitimate use, but it needs to be managed in a responsible way. Of course, it also requires the shooters to be responsible, and if they're given a place to go, then hopefully they'll be a little bit more responsible. The ones who are not already responsible become more responsible and make it safer for everybody out there. One last question, I just thought of it while we were talking about that. I keep hearing rumors that you're going to be doing there may be a seasonal closure of Mount Herman Road as part of your future. Is that any truth to those rumors, or what's the story with that?
So the other project from a recreation standpoint is that we finally have a decision on our motorized vehicle use map. And we had a decision that was signed by Diane Trejo, the forest supervisor, back in September of last year. And right now we're working internally, trying to develop a plan to try to implement that plan. We're going to need, again, volunteers to help us with that. I expect full implementation of that will span many years, and we're going to be able to make changes on the ground. And once those changes are made on the ground, we'll be able to print new emblem maps, which really are what show where people can go and how they can travel on the national forest. Once we do implement some of the changes on the ground, we'll be able to edit and change our motorized vehicle use maps to reflect those changes, and then reprint those and get those out to the public. Once those changes, again, are implemented and on the map and out to the public, that's when the public can use those areas a little differently than they have in the past. Currently, we have a 2018 motorized vehicle use map. With this new decision, we hope to implement some changes on the ground. And once those changes are implemented, we'll be able to edit our motorized vehicle use map to reflect those changes. And then the public will be able to see that. The new motorized vehicle use map will then be the golden standard that will show where people can go on the National Forest.
So that about a roundabout way, say maybe on Mount Herman Road, or is that coming, or what's?
Mount Herman Road, yes, is, I believe, if I remember correctly, slated for have a seasonal closure implemented on that. As to when that is going to be implemented, I can't really say right now. I'm not sure. I think we have some higher priority areas that we're going to work on, but it is on the list, and people will be able to know when we implement that is when we change things on the ground. We're going to probably add some signing. We might need to move some gates, and I don't know how fast we can implement that particular part of the project. But once it's done, we'll reflect that in the new motorized vehicle use map. I think we'll get on an annual basis again of reproducing that map, and that map should be more up to date and show where people can go and utilize motorized vehicles on the National Forest.
Okay, fair enough. Carl, thank you so much for being on the show again. Really appreciate it. A lot of good information out there today, and I think maybe people will get a better understanding of the scope of work that you do and your district does, and the U.S. Forest Service in general does. It's a lot more than just giving people places to go camp. It's managing the timber and managing fire and managing users and managing watersheds and heck, I get lost trying to keep track of all that stuff you guys do. So somehow you managed to do it. But I really want to thank you for being on the program again. A lot of great information there, and thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Glad to do it.
Okay, everybody, and that was Carl Bauer, the District Ranger for the Pikes Peak Ranger District of the U.S. Forest Service. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.
Before you go, did you know you can rate and review our Studio 809 podcasts? That will help us because our egos really need to have thousands and thousands of listeners. But that helps our wonderful sponsors reach more ears too. And we do love our sponsors. So just go to Studio 809 or any individual 809 podcast in your iTunes or podcast app and click on ratings and reviews. Thanks.